Oh, goody.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Zombies here again, and today we're back with another Marvel Snap video. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about Luke Cage. When Rocket and Groot came out last week, there was a bit of confusion because how it interacts with Luke Cage was very different than the previous card we had that did something similar, Scream. If you don't know, Scream still steals power when Luke Cage is on board. The opponent still gets that negative affliction. Luke Cage just prevents that number from actually going into the negative, but Scream still gained the 2 power from the thing she stole from. And Rocket and Groot does not work that way. And so people were asking, hey, is this a bug? And the initial reply was there was no intent to change this card's function relative to existing interactions like Scream. So essentially, yes, this is not working how we intended it to, and they're probably going to change that. But we did have a more recent follow-up that takes a much different stance towards this interaction. And here we have 10 days later, very recently, amending this answer. Scream is the bug, not Rocket and Groot. We'll be updating her to behave in the same way. So I don't like the way he answered this, personally. I think this is like not super accurate to say, well, Scream is actually the bug. It's been bugged for 4 months, but no one ever noticed. I think what is much more likely to have happened here is they took a look at the function of stealing from a card and said, hey, you know, if you can't steal from something, why are you gaining the power? Which I don't think that's an unreasonable stance to take on it, especially if you want a more meaningful distinction between what stealing is as opposed to just what affliction is. That seems fine to me. But I think calling it a bug is a bit of a misstep, especially when you initially confirmed that Scream is working the right way, and now it's saying, well, no, Scream was actually wrong. It's like, I think it's fine to make that change in general, but I think calling it a bug is just not the right way to go about it, because, I mean, if they thought it was a bug, would that not have been, you know, communicated earlier? Is this not coming from the person who's in charge of designing a lot of these cards? Did they not ever think about how that interaction worked? Or were they not surprised to see how that interaction worked when the card came out 4 months ago and it's been working that way ever since? So if you haven't seen this, basically they're going to be changing it so Scream will no longer be able to steal power when a Luke Cage is on the board. She won't get that plus power, and if you shut off the Luke Cage, it's not going to give back any negative power. And there's been a lot of discussion about this. I'm not the biggest fan of this change. I do think it makes sense. I think if they want to make more steel cards, it makes sense to make them a little bit different, and I can understand why they might want to differentiate between steel and afflict. But the main reason I don't love this change is actually about Luke Cage himself. And that's Luke is just becoming this massive, like, load-bearing silver bullet tech card. That I think he's just becoming way too efficient at what he does. For a long time, Luke Cage was a more defensive tech card. He said, hey, if my opponent is playing some affliction stuff, I'm going to say no to that, with the added upside of occasionally you will get a benefit from that with locations that have things to do with negative power or affliction. And he was a fine card, but a little while ago, last year, we got Anti-Venom, and that's a card we have been seeing a whole ton of the last few months, and it's because it gave Luke Cage a reason to be a proactive tech card rather than purely a reactive tech card. Now, there were other cards that also helped him out. A good example of this was like the Buff to Man thing, Ajax coming out. There are more and more cards that have come out where it has become beneficial to say, hey, my cards can't get afflicted by my own afflict effects. So he was already starting to get stronger in terms of not just being defensive, but offensive tech. But I think Anti-Venom's really what pushed it over the edge, because Anti-Venom is just a super duper strong card. Being able to make a card free and then remove the downside of it losing its stats with Luke Cage is just really, really good. And at the same time, you get all the other benefits Cage has to offer of protecting you versus bad locations, versus other afflict decks, etc. So it just feels like this card is doing way too much for its current cost. And I'm going to make a not so hot take here in that I do not think Luke Cage is going to exist in his current form long term. Especially because it seems like they want to do more affliction support on the horizon with cards like Diamondback, which are going to increase the amount your afflictions do. So anything that's afflicted gets an additional -2. I find it very hard to believe they're going to try and sell that to people with a straight face with current Luke Cage. Because why would somebody play that card? Like when Luke Cage is going in every deck under the sun right now, even ones that don't run Affliction, or even some that don't run Anti-Venom, or just running it as defensive tech against those decks. It's just become this omnipresent, very easily splashable card. And Luke Cage has gone through a bunch of revisions over time. If you've been with Marvel Snap for a while, you might remember at the start, Luke Cage was originally a 2/1, and then they eventually buffed him up a bit before deciding, well, we don't really want a 2-drop of having this global effect, so they nerfed Luke Cage to be only in his one lane. And that didn't go over so hot. That was really, really bad. Luke Cage fell out of favor of the meta for a very long time. So they eventually decided to make him a 3-cost that gets his global effect back. And then he did suffer another fairly decent nerf when the change was made with the Shadow King interaction. So Luke Cage no longer stopped Shadow King. But even since then, the card has just done nothing but thrive and become more present and popular in a variety of different decks. And I think that's only going to continue to happen as they print more Affliction support or other cards like Anti-Venom in the future. And we have some follow-up questions regarding Luke Cage here. And I think this is one a lot of people have. I was curious if the team is happy with keeping Luke Cage's effect the same for the foreseeable future. Afflict effects are becoming more and more popular over time, and Ajax quickly became one of my favorite archetypes. However, Luke Cage becomes sort of strange in that while he's an all-star to prevent your own cards from hurting yourself, if played or copied by the opponent, he totally nullifies everything your cards do. Has the team ever considered splitting his effect into 2 cards, one for friendly affliction as a build-around, and one for opposing cards afflicting you as a tech choice? If so, which would Luke Cage be? We have considered it, but we aren't taking that kind of action right now. I think that's a reasonable way to go about this. I mean, one suggestion I liked with something like this is splitting it up into essentially 2 different cards, where one protects its own lane and one protects the other lanes or adjacent lanes or whatnot. So a card that I think is ripe for a buff like this would be something like Colossus. Colossus has never seen play, I don't think, in any metagame ever outside of maybe a new player trying to make a Spectrum deck work. Colossus has been bad for his whole time. You don't even really have to remove Colossus's text. You just have to add to it. So you can make Colossus be the one that defends his own lane, so your things can't be afflicted here, or all things can't be afflicted here, or whatever you want it to be. And then you could have Luke Cage affect the other lanes or adjacent lanes, depending on how you want to word it and how strong you want that effect to be. But I think that could be one way of splitting up this effect, because right now it's just so ridiculously splashable, just being able to get it in with one card, hard countering a whole archetype, as well as having all these other upsides with locations and Anti-Venom. So I think increasing the cost to, hey, you have to have 2 cards here if you want that full global anti-affliction effect, I think that could be a good way to make it so Luke Cage would probably still be played quite a bit, but he's not this perfect silver bullet answer that is both used offensively and defensively in more decks than you can count than he is right now. But it sounds like that's not the course of action they're at least considering for the short-term future. I think there are some other things they could consider with Luke Cage in the short term, and there are 2 types of changes here. One, you just make it cost more and you make him a bit bigger. I would not be surprised to see Luke Cage become a 4-drop, because 4-drops become immediately less splashable than 3s. 3s have kind of had this renaissance where 3-drops are just so very good, and we have so many good 3-drops that you can see decks just playing 2 3-drops on the final turn of the game. A lot of times, Luke Cage will be held for the final turn of the game, so that way it can't get sniped by a rogue or a red guardian or an enchantress. So it is beneficial to actually be able to hold to the final turn, and with how 3-drops have gotten more powerful over time, with things like Gladiator, Nocturne, Copycat, the list goes on. The more powerful 3-drops we have, the better it has positioned things for Luke Cage as another 3-drop you can weave in alongside a 3 on turn 6 or alongside a decent 2 on turn 5. So making the card cost a bit more could help to make it not so flexible to where it's going in every deck, but it's still serving its purpose, because I do think it's, even though Luke Cage is doing more than it should, they're in kind of a tricky spot because all of Affliction has been balanced around Luke Cage. And it kind of sucks for something like High Evolutionary that just can't manage to compete, taking some collateral damage here for the fact that Ajax is a really good affliction deck, anti-venom decks are really good. These strategies are very popular in making more Luke Cage prominent, and it's making a different affliction deck, which is already having a hard time in high evo, have an even harder time. So anything that could make Luke Cage a bit less popular to help out those kind of less popular versions of this archetype, I think would be pretty welcome. But they do have to be careful, because if you nerf Luke Cage too harshly, these affliction decks could get out of control really quickly. Or maybe they have to nerf some affliction stuff alongside Luke Cage, kind of price that in. It's hard to say for sure. It definitely feels like it's been balanced very precariously around Cage. So it wouldn't surprise me that if Cage ended up taking a hit, it might require zooming out a bit and looking at the whole context surrounding affliction as an archetype and a mechanic. One other suggestion I thought was kind of an interesting way to go about it for Luke Cage would be Luke Cage preventing the first point of affliction. So Hazmat prevents all the Hazmat points, prevents the first time something gets procced, but it's only stopping one of those multiple negatives. So if Cyclops blasts a thing once, that first one isn't counted, but the second time he starts blasting, then you'll have that. And this would be very handy for something like Diamondback that's going to be adding 2 to affliction, because that would still work through a Luke Cage, but you would still have to get more than that 1 affliction. The only place that could be kind of weird is with ongoing effects like Man-Thing or some of the location ones, and that could require some weird wording or weird coding of it, which is one reason I could see them maybe not doing that, but I did like that as a possible idea. There was also some confusion about this with Cassandra Nova and Silver Sable, as those are steel cards too, so if they're going to change how Scream works, are those cards going to be changed? And the answer is no, those cards affect things that are in your deck. When afflict effects happen to things in your hand or in your deck, that's not something that is protected by ongoing cards. So you're not going to see any changes with those interactions like we are Scream. And here we can see the answer to that. If there was a card that prevented cards in deck from being afflicted, then Nova or Sable would be affected by that card, but there isn't. While Luke can disable their steal effect after the fact, a reduction did occur. We decided to draw the line on that element. And then we have another comment here asking if Luke preventing this stuff entirely, is that going to affect Hazmat in the future? And he's basically saying, no, it's not going to affect Hazmat, because we're trying to draw a line here between stealing versus afflicting. So now going forward, if you see steal, you kind of know what to expect, where if Luke Cage is in play, the stealing won't happen. The other part of it is still going to work how it does. If you play a Luke Cage after the fact, it's not going to retroactively take away power from the card that stole, like Cassandra Nova or Scream or Silver Sable or whatever. So it's not going to take their power away, but it will negate all the negative power done to them. But if they are in play, it is going to be stopping those specific steal effects if they are interacting with cards on the board. So yeah, I thought this was a bit of an interesting topic to talk about. I'm curious to see what people are feeling about Luke Cage right now, because like I said before, I think it's kind of a tough position to be in, where you don't want to go very hard on nerfing Luke Cage, because I think he is holding back affliction becoming potentially a much more like oppressive deck, where right now it's like, but it's not like this unbeatable thing. And I think if we lived in a world with a significantly worse Luke Cage or no Luke Cage, it would be much more problematic. And the metagame balance right now seems to be pretty decent. So I am curious to see how they end up handling this, because I don't know about all of you, but I see Luke Cage more than almost any 3-drop nowadays. And I think mainly it's that becoming a offensive tool as well as a defensive tool that I think is really pushing him over the edge. And so I'm kind of curious if and or how they're going to reel that kind of thing in, because I imagine that's not something they want to be how it is long term, because it kind of limits their design space, especially with the upcoming Diamondback card, which if I were a betting man, I would say it is a safe bet that sometime between now and Diamondback's release, Luke Cage will not exist in the current form he is right now. But I just wanted to get this information out there, so now you know Scream, Luke Cage interaction going to be changing. That's how they're going to be handling this type of text going forward. We don't know when exactly, but it could be as soon as this week's OTA. Curious to see what they have for the OTA. Not really sure what to expect there. Let me know what you think in the comments below about this decision and change. as well as what you might like to see in the upcoming OTA. But that's going to wrap it up for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, remember to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.